Ta-da!
Hello fantasy gamers, Matthew here from Grey Army Gaming in Lund, Sweden. For today's Musings of a Philogamer, we will be looking at the topic Emotional Armies on the interrelation of reason and emotion in army selection. Before we get started, I would just like to direct you to greyarmygaming.com. If you go to the top of the website and click on Downloads, you will be directed to a page where you can download this essay. Whether you want to read it now along with this or you want to look at it later, feel free to download the PDF file and take a look at it. Quite possibly the most mysterious moment in the wargaming hobby comes at the very beginning, namely the precise point at which the gamer makes a decision to commit to a particular army. I remember quite clearly this dynamic when I began my venture into the Warhammer fantasy universe. Upon walking into my local game store, I was confronted with a wall full of what seemed to be hundreds of boxes of miniatures. Orcs and goblins, high elves, dwarves, empire, chaos, beastmen. Which army should I choose? What kind of player do I want to become? At first I was overwhelmed by the abundant possibilities, a feeling many who live in wealthy consumer societies experience on a regular basis. But after taking a step back and a deep breath, the answer came to me as if by inspiration. High elves. In what follows, I would like to reflect upon the unique dynamic of army selection, and to ask the question of what it is exactly that informs the decision we make about the army to which we choose to dedicate ourselves. Of course, it is important here in our analysis that we are not reductive. Army selection is a complex phenomenon that is certainly influenced by many factors. For some of us, practical concerns have largely guided our decision. Perhaps one army was the cheapest. Perhaps our local store only stocked a couple of armies. Or perhaps we purchased a starter set with a particular army already provided. My focus here, however, is on the other cases in which we indeed seem to be faced with an open choice. Too often I have heard post hoc justifications of army selections that go something like this. How did I decide? Well, I simply weighed the options and made the only rational choice. My claim is that the phenomenon is not that simple. Granted, there is certainly an aspect of rationality that goes into army selection, but I would also like to argue that alongside such rationality is also a crucial emotional component. When we begin our battles then, I suggest what we have before us, in a very concrete sense, is in fact emotional armies. In order to develop my argument, we may begin with a brief discussion of the general interrelation of rationality and emotion in the decision-making process. A good resource here is the book written by renowned neurologist Antonio Damasio, entitled Descartes Error: Emotion, Reason, and the Human Brain. In this work, Damasio takes on the long-running assumption that decisions fall strictly under the auspices of rationality, and that any influence by emotion is merely detrimental to the decision-making process. Instead, he makes the case that emotions are not only non-detrimental, but they are in fact central to the proper functioning of rational choice. At the heart of Damasio's account is his neurological analysis of the case of Phineas Gage. Gage is a 25-year-old construction foreman for Rutland and Burlington Railroad who was working in Vermont in 1848 when his life takes a dramatic turn. While carrying out some routine rock blasting to make way for the tracks, in which Gage is packing sand and powder with a 3-foot 7-inch long iron rod into drilled holes, there is a sudden and unexpected explosion. Gage is thrown backwards by the force, but not before the rod passes through his left cheek and pierces the front portion of his brain. Although one would expect such an accident to result in instantaneous death, Gage nevertheless survives, and moreover is able to walk and talk immediately afterwards. Within 2 months, he is pronounced recovered. But Gage never really becomes his old self again. Although his intellectual capacities remain intact, his personality changes dramatically. He is no longer temperate and honorable, but instead is uncontrolled and uncouth. More strikingly, Gage is no longer able to make good life-improving decisions. Sadly, his poor choices lead him into a life filled with itinerancy and unhappiness. For Damasio, this is an important case because of what it suggests about brain structure, brain function, and emotion. Through analysis of Gage's and similar cases, it was concluded that the tamping iron injury resulted in damage to Gage's prefrontal cortex, which is significant because it is this area of the brain that is associated with, among other things, emotion. As such, Damasio concludes that one of the more important, if not the most important factor behind Gage's troubles in life, and particularly his difficulty in choosing well, was his impaired emotional capacity. The connection between impaired emotion and decision impairment is made even clearer in the parallel case of one of Damasio's patients. Just as with Gage, this patient suffered from frontal lobe damage and, like Gage, he was both coherent and intelligent, but lacked emotional depth. Such emotional deficiency, argues Damasio, is directly tied to the patient's brain damage and has a detrimental effect on the patient's ability to make rational decisions. Consider this story Damasio tells about trying to book an appointment time with his patient. I suggested 2 alternative dates, both in the coming month and just a few days apart from each other. The patient pulled out his appointment book and began consulting the calendar. The behavior that ensued was remarkable. For the better part of a half hour, the patient enumerated reasons for and against each of the 2 dates: previous engagements, proximity to other engagements, possible meteorological conditions, virtually anything that one could reasonably think about concerning a simple date. It took enormous discipline to listen to all of this without pounding on the table and telling him to stop. But we finally did tell him, quietly, that he should come on the second of the alternative dates. His response was equally calm and prompt. He simply said, "That's fine." Back the appointment book went into his pocket, and then he was off. In Damasio's view, this example displays how in practical real-life situations of choice, reason alone is unable to come to a conclusion, but instead requires the nudge of the emotions and the emotional brain. For a thinker like Søren Kierkegaard, this is precisely what it means to say that passionate commitment is necessary for bringing the deliberative process to a close. All of this is summarized well by Damasio when he notes, "At their best, feelings point us in the proper direction, take us to the appropriate place in a decision-making space where we may put the instruments of logic to good use." Armed with this discussion of the interrelation of rationality and emotion in the decision-making process, we may now return to the phenomenon of army selection. Accompany me once again to the game store of so many years ago, the store with its overwhelming wall of armies looming over me, the wide-eyed consumer. As I hinted at above, the problem facing me here is that I am offered an incredible wealth of possibilities, all of which are equally as good. As Damasio's patient makes apparent, it is entirely possible to deliberate endlessly in a rational fashion concerning the benefits and drawbacks of choosing any one of the armies over the others. Yes, the dwarves are powerful, but they're also awfully slow. The Empire has great numbers, but they sure get killed easily. On the one hand, Skaven are fast, but on the other hand, they have rather poor leadership. It is here in this perpetual back and forth of cost-benefit analysis that rationality becomes paralyzed. And it is here that the emotions, what Damasio characterizes in terms of somatic markers, and what Kierkegaard describes as the passion of existence, must step in so as to overcome the inner infinity of rationality and push us to make a commitment. It will be the High Elves. It is important to note, however, that emotions never occur within a vacuum. Rather, our emotional responses have largely been shaped and molded by our particular context and lived experience. To return to my own example, it is perhaps not strange that I made the emotional choice in favor of the High Elves. For much of my upbringing, my parents have emphasized the importance of the character traits of goodness and nobility, and it is around these that much of my early emotional life was formed. The emotional pull to the High Elves as the forces of order therefore seems entirely natural and consistent with my own emotional narrative. Of course, this is not to say that those players drawn to the forces of destruction thereby lack emotional connection to goodness and nobility. Rather, such choices simply are informed by alternative emotional narratives that are themselves equally valid. For example, one's loving mother may have played Skaven, which would in turn instill an emotional affinity for the vermin in the child who has now become an adult gamer. Regardless, the point here is simply that whatever emotional path leads you to your decision in army selection, this path is always one that has already been forged more or less by those individuals and experiences that have made an emotional impact upon you. To conclude, I leave you with this final word. Whether you are faced with the decision of selecting your first army, or whether you are looking to select a new army, think about our discussion here. Indeed, there are certainly good rational reasons for any choice you will make. But don't forget that this choosing is at the same time guided by emotion. And in choosing, you come alongside me and a host of other gamers in marching into the wargaming universe in command of an emotional army. Thank you for joining us here today at Grey Army Gaming, where Grey can always play.